Number 1 Clapham Road, The Diary of a Squat. Thursday, August the 3rd, 1989.
My heart was beating wildly when I came back to number 1 Clapham Road this evening, after several months of absence. I didn't know what and who I was going to find, and especially whether or not they would let me in. I was terrified at the thought of being turned away. When I reached the familiar gate with the worn-out banner, "People Not Profit," far above, floating softly in the evening breeze, I found an old woman with a sweet face and another character with tattoos all over his fat body who looked more like Rambo except for the punk hairstyle. Marianne asked me with a gentle smile, "Do you live here?" I mumbled something about having lived there before and wanting to live there again. She said, "Well, come in then. What are you waiting for?" I was amazed. The gate was not even locked, nor did Marianne and her friend appear to be guarding the place. They were just sitting there like pensioners who watched the street life from their balcony. Anyway, I didn't ask questions and slipped in, with a hard-to-explain feeling of wonder at all the things that were to be lived and all the people that were to be met on the other side of this gate. In the common room I found Polly, a middle-aged woman with 2 plastic bags and a little white poodle called Mitchell, and Arthur, a bearded Jamaican in his early 30s, who was sitting in a white rocking chair, patiently listening to Polly. She'd found herself on the street that morning after her landlord had told her that he could not stand Mitchell any longer. Hearing that, she immediately packed her belongings in these 2 plastic bags and walked through the door with her beloved Mitchell. Somewhere or another, she'd heard about the Belgrave squat, so there she was, talking Arthur's ear off, not having a clue as to what the next day would bring. Arthur turned out to be quite an articulate fellow, and gave me an outline of what had happened since I left last February. Quite a story. It's a bit of a miracle that this ship has kept afloat all this time, through the storms and sunshine, with no other crew than this moving bunch of so-called useless bums, dossers, pissheads, weirdos, prostitutes, loafers, kleptomaniacs, beggars, shoplifters, Don Quixotes, and only a few people who would be regarded as normal by the rest of society. It was too late to find a room and tidy it up, so a little later Polly and I, and of course Mitchell, crashed out in the common room. Never has the sound of snoring seemed so sweet.
Friday, August the 4th.
Came back to the squat in the early evening. Talked to Peter, a fine man in his mid-60s, who welcomes new residents. I vaguely remember him from the early days. He used to sit quietly and go along with the crowd, but now he appears to be the person who works hardest to keep the squat going. He's still quiet and soft-spoken, but he keeps the accounts, often deals with outsiders, takes many initiatives, and is often found cleaning or helping. He's not particularly clever or articulate, but rich in human qualities and experience. As far as I can see, he's respected and appreciated for what he does, though he has no authority of any kind. Peter gave me a short briefing reminding me that I should not drink in the premises, or harass women, or shit inside the building. The roles were now reversed. The homeless were letting me in on their own terms. It was a moving scene. I was then taken to the kitchen for a meal. At the moment, Dave is in charge of the cooking, 3 meals a day. He too is a bit of a do-gooder, but with a somewhat stronger ego than Peter, and definitely a longer tongue. More assertive, less patient, but a good guy. A few other people were hanging around, drinking tea and chatting. John, a young man who wants to become a herbalist and go around the world telling people what they can do with the local plants. A Turkish fellow named Mustafa, who seems to suffer from mental depression, and Marianne. They were immediately friendly and talkative. Donald, also called the sumo fighter, because he has a potbelly and a pigtail and often goes around wearing nothing more than a towel, was particularly amiable. He told me there was a nice empty room opposite him in the same corridor on the 4th floor, and proceeded to show it to me. As we went up, I came across many interesting notices on the wall. Please attend the meeting on such and such date. Football on Saturday at 5 p.m, etc. It was really encouraging to see these signs of community living. I saw a few of the rooms that were already occupied, and the way some of them had been transformed was quite astounding. Donald's room itself looked very cosy, with beautiful furniture picked up from skips, nice crockery carefully laid on a charming round table, and a flowery bed cover. Each of the 4 walls was covered from floor to ceiling with pictures of women, some naked, some not. Jessie's apartment, nestled at the very top of the building, was a fit scene for a fairy tale, with huge plants, colour-splashed walls, psychedelic curtains, and an antique canopy. Donald showed me a few vacant rooms, each time describing their attributes and pros and cons in detail. However, I ended up sleeping in the common room again, because Polly wanted to sleep there and wanted someone that can be trusted, as she put it, to be around.
Thursday, August the 3rd. Oh no, it's Saturday. Saturday, August the 3rd.
The room opposite Donald's has been promptly taken over by someone else, so I found myself another room in an empty wing on the first floor called the Annex, and proceeded to clean it up. It was in a terrible mess. There were interesting love poems on the wall and a lot of evangelical Christian literature scattered about, aside from old socks, letters, crumbs, rags, all sorts. I found enough abandoned furniture around the building to bring some life to the room. Most of the faces are friendly. Most of them are also new, with a few exceptions. Shorty, Peter, Rachel, Bobby. People come and go. Some of those who used to be here are now squatting up the road, but still come around from time to time. There are only about 45 people staying at the moment, mainly because the sun is shining and because of a temporary strain in the food situation. I'm told that 200 people were living here at the end of winter. A hell of a row broke out while I was sitting with Arthur in the common room. It has to be said that Marianne tends to live in her own little world most of the time. She rambles endlessly about things that nobody, certainly not me, can understand. On the whole, it's really amazing how patient everyone is with her. In fact, she's treated with great affection by many, but inevitably, she does get on some people's nerves. Either to tease her or to annoy her, Reg knocked her hat as he was going past her in the corridor. Then she started abusing him at the top of her voice. Arthur tried to intervene, and eventually even shouted at her, with the only effect that she took him as a new target and shouted that she would break every one of his bones. These small incidents are common, but evidently they do wear some people out, like Mustafa, who always looks depressed.
Sunday, August the 6th.
Tonight we had a meeting. Every Sunday and Wednesday night around 8 p.m, there's a meeting to discuss the practicalities of life in the squat. Everyone is urged, but of course not forced, to participate. Each meeting is chaired by a different person and decisions are taken by simple majority vote. These regular meetings are our lifeline. I should mention that the management of the squat is now informal to the point of utopia. There's no hierarchy, no leadership, no committee, not even a rota system. The positive aspect of this is that there is no trace of authoritarianism. People are now very clear that we are all equal and that no one is running the place. The danger, which is recognised by many, is a lack of organisation. At the moment, a lot depends on individuals' goodwill and initiative, with a few people, especially Peter and Dave, playing an important role. But the key to decision making really consists of the twice weekly general assemblies, as they're called. At a broader level, these meetings are the heart of the political life of the squat. Today's meeting was short and routine. About 25 people were present. Peter was chairing. The main topic was the financial situation, which can be pretty accurately summed up as desperate. The squat used to get a lot of free food from the Simon community, but for a variety of reasons this source of supply has now dried up. The food and cleaning bill depends entirely on individual contributions from within the squat. At the moment the weekly rent is £5 a week, but only about half of the residents pay. There are only £10 left in the cash box to last until Wednesday. Another source of current anxiety is the question of gatekeeping. As I said, the gate is now wide open most of the time. People realise that troublemakers could move in any time, and that this is particularly likely to happen once the weather deteriorates and food comes in again. There was some discussion about various ways of controlling who comes and goes. At one point Peter said, quietly but firmly, "Even if you invest £5,000 in security, people will still come in if they want to." Which is basically a perceptive remark. This whole problem has apparently been discussed umpteen times already, and we didn't resolve it today. However, it was decided to reintroduce a rota system to ensure that there is always someone at the gate. Though the meeting was short, I was quite impressed by the improved style of functioning compared with the early days. On the whole, it was very orderly and constructive. People listened to each other, and nobody shouted. There was also a high rate of participation in the discussion. Perhaps it's not that hard to learn to live together.
Monday, August the 7th.
Had a long discussion in the morning with Graham. He has long blonde hair, sparkling blue eyes, and he's very friendly. He gave me a hard-headed but very perceptive analysis of the current situation in the squat. As he sees it, there is a real problem of lack of organisation. Many people don't care or take advantage of others. Some do-gooders take initiatives, cleaning, cooking, keeping the gate, etc. But after a while they get tired of it. Also, if you do something for the squat, sooner or later people turn around on you and blame you for one reason or another, so there's little point. Come the winter and all sorts of problems will arise. Nor does he see any solution to this state of affairs. He's against any permanent committee of the kind that a guy called Tim Saylor had formed to manage the squat, as this would destroy the spirit of equality. Rota systems don't work either, because the same people end up doing everything. I think it's fair to say that at least some of these misgivings are widely shared, and that there's a creeping sense of disillusion in the squat. But there's also a good deal of optimism, and certainly no lack of goodwill. Later, I was to discover that Arthur and Graham are the most persistently critical members of the squat. Both used to be very active and enthusiastic, but they finally lost patience with a lack of response from other people. So now they've withdrawn. They still attend meetings and do their fair share of work, but not more. I offered to help with the washing up before leaving the squat in the morning, but I was told that this was Marianne's job and that it gave her something to do, and that she got angry when someone interfered.
Tuesday, August the 8th.
Came to Clapham Road late in the evening with Topsy Jewel, and we kept the gate together from 11 p.m. until the early morning. The job simply consists of sitting by the gate and letting people in when they come. In the early morning, Eddie took his turn. Eddie's an old man, around 70, who tends to live in a world of his own. He is at the moment the only person in the squat to be exempted from paying rent, on the grounds that he's too poor to pay and that he does his bit by keeping the gate every morning. At one point there was a lot of excitement after somebody threw a window down onto the street. The police came and scolded us and said that somebody could have been killed, and if it happened again that night they would come and clear the place. This threat generated passionate discussion and a lot of resentment towards the person that had done this silly thing. Had a long talk with Dave. He's a real chatterbox, and he also seemed to be keen to impress Topsy. The way he monopolised the conversation with other people, even when they were obviously far from convinced, put me off a bit. Dave is much more clear-minded and articulate than most of the others, but he's also much better off generally. He has a job and apparently lives there mainly because he wants to save money and find himself a good flat. However, he strikes me as well-intentioned and definitely very conscious of the need to maintain a spirit of equality and participation in the squat. Before we started the gate duty, I asked whether it was really necessary to stay there all night and whether we could perhaps lock the gate and go to sleep by 2 a.m. or so. This suggestion was greeted with incredulity and consternation. There is obviously no question of taking the risk of anyone finding himself or herself locked out, especially in the middle of the night.
Wednesday, August the 9th.
We had another meeting this evening. About 30 people attended. Pauline was chairing, and she did it, I thought, with great patience and skill. We managed to discuss and settle about 8 different issues within an hour and a half or so. The highlight of the meeting was a long speech by Sumo Donald, who at one point suddenly got up and stood in the middle of the room and started passionately exhorting people to help each other because we are all one big family, and unless we all work together to make the place work, everything will go to the dogs. His colourful expressions and constant waving of both arms in the air, in the manner of an orchestra conductor, produced a poignant effect. He seemed to be a bit tipsy and reminded me of Patsy, who used to turn up at meetings completely soaked and stumble through a paternal exhortation of this kind until he collapsed from exhaustion. The meeting was not an easy one. On the whole, the participation was very good, and people did listen to each other, but at several points there was shouting and arguing. One guy in particular, Derek, kept shouting about various grievances, like finding the gate closed when he recently came back in the middle of the night, and being quite disruptive. Fortunately, the participants were very patient with his outbursts, and Pauline handled the whole situation with so much skill that we did muddle through. The agenda of the meeting was a hodgepodge of minor and major matters. Peter read the weekly accounts. We discussed the problems of many people not paying their rent, even those said someone who make £40 or £50 a day begging. Julian, a small and skinny chap who looks like a relic of the 60s and speaks with a strong Oxford accent, argued that people who don't pay their rent have to go. I asked who would throw them out, and everybody laughed when someone said Julian. Somebody suggested that only people who pay their rent and can produce their receipt should be given food, and that the others should be allowed to stay but not to eat. This was nearly unanimously approved. Pauline explained how she'd met a woman who was squatting nearby and faced great hardship and didn't want to join us, but had asked us whether she could eat here if she paid £5 a week. Needless to say, this was unanimously accepted. There was a complaint about dog shit being regularly found in the corridors. People argued about how many dogs there were in the house. Estimates varied from 3 to 6, and which ones could be the culprits. Julian contended that Jessie's dog was beyond reproach, but this theory met with scepticism. Eventually it was agreed that the dog owners would be requested to clean the shit. There was, of course, no question of barring dogs from the house. The issue of gatekeeping was debated once again. It was decided to fix a bell to avoid the need for permanent watching. Craig, who lives in the room nearest to the door with Pauline, swore that he would open the door whenever someone turned up in the night. The meeting was attended by an outsider, Michael Keane, who works in Christchurch, round the corner on Brixton Road. Christchurch has been providing support to the squat for the last few months, mainly by lending its pots and pans, many of which predictably disappeared, opening its kitchen from time to time, and, through Michael, facilitating contacts with the outside world. At the end of the meeting, Pauline said that Michael wanted to say a few things. Michael started explaining in a very eloquent way how he thought the squat should become a proper organisation and have rules, etc. He'd prepared a draft constitution and wanted to form a working party to study it before the next meeting. He also made several other suggestions aimed at achieving more order and organisation, and defended each of them with long arguments. The whole scene was a bit disturbing. Personally, I thought that some of his ideas were not bad. Basically, he wants to organise the squat as a cooperative. But he was really in a different world, and the draft constitution in particular was very complicated and wordy, and basically gobbledygook for most of us. I could see that some of those present were put off by the way that Michael was suddenly dominating the whole discussion, but others were obviously taken by his eloquence. 8 people, including myself, volunteered to form the Working Party. Among Michael's suggestions, and one of the cornerstones of his draft constitution, was that squatters should only become proper members of the cooperative after 6 weeks of orderly residence. Craig told him point blank that this was bullshit, and that we were here to provide people with a home, not to make them homeless, and that we didn't want a system where people needed to pass some test in order to become members of the elite. There were other debates along similar lines, with Michael on the whole getting the upper hand. These questions will no doubt arise again when the Constitution is properly discussed.
Thursday, August the 10th.
Out all day.
Friday, August the 11th.
Met Bob Nind at home early in the morning. Bob Nind was involved in squatting the space, and has been a faithful supporter ever since. He gave me a broad picture of what has been happening since I left in February. Obviously there have been ups and downs, episodes of strife and aimlessness, as well as episodes of flourishing. I suggested that we revive the initial support network. Bob called Michael Keane and asked him to see me this very morning. I went to see Michael and had a long chat with him. This entirely dispelled the somewhat negative impression he'd given me at the meeting on Wednesday. Of course, he does have a tendency to rush ahead, but at least he's well aware of it and very receptive to suggestions and criticisms. He explained that the draft constitution was not just his own initiative, but a follow-up of a few discussions he'd had with Michael Davis and a few others. He was only too willing to let people in the squat meet on their own and write their own constitution if they wanted. He also liked the idea of reviving a support network and of discharging some of his current responsibilities to others. Michael is frustrated that nothing seems to last at number 1 Clapham Road. People come and people go, and so do all rules and decisions. But perhaps it's in the nature of this ship that it has no harbour and no course, that it drifts with the people and the mood of the time, sailing plain today, battered tomorrow, turning over once in a while. Spent a good deal of the time during the day sitting in the kitchen, sipping tea and chatting. The kitchen is the real common room now, and tea is available almost continuously. There are many different views as to how this place should be organised. Some think it can't be organised. Others long for some messiah who will pull it together. Others distrust any form of leadership. Others think that a committee of well-intentioned people can be formed to provide some coordination without authoritarianism. Quite a few are discouraged and even depressed about the way things are going. There's something beautiful about it. They care for this place. I had the good surprise of bumping into good old Fat Steve on the street. Fat Steve is a very likeable fellow who joined us on the very first day of the squat in January. He saw his face on TV in the evening while he was having a drink in the pub, and after that he walked around in a daze for a couple of days, telling everybody about it. He's about 30, jumbo size as his name indicates, but not bad looking with his new beard. He begs every Saturday in Leicester Square, where he says that he can make £20 or £30 in a couple of hours, and spends the rest of the time taking it easy, and of course getting pissed fairly regularly. The poor guy was mugged yesterday in broad daylight by 20 black youngsters on the housing estate in Brixton, where he's now squatting with Sarah and Muzzy. His body is aching all over the place, and he grumbles, "Fucking hell, man. If I met one of them in the street, I'd beat the shit out of them. Do you know what I mean?" New people move in every day. I have the impression that the numbers are growing fast.
Saturday, August the 12th.
When I came down in the morning, I learnt that Dane, the Rambo-like figure who was at the gate the first day with Marianne, had been sentenced to 90 days in prison for some unspecified crime. Pity. At the squat, I've always seen him as very gentle and friendly, even if he is clearly not afraid of a good fight. Yesterday it was Muzzy's turn to get mugged in broad daylight. He, Fat Steve and Muzzy, Sarah, that's Muzzy's girlfriend, are fed up and have moved in again. They used to live with us at the beginning. Steve brought a puppy that he found abandoned. The poor thing is sick, and you should see how Steve mothers it hour after hour. Following Michael Keane's advice, I went to see Ian McGowan, who belongs to St Mark's, the church just across the road from the squat. Since the very beginning, St Mark's, like Christchurch, has been lending a helping hand to the squat, though the other hand has kept a firm grip on the Bible and has never ignored what the other hand was doing. At one stage, one hand was bringing free food regularly, while the other was holding weekly prayer meetings. Ian lives down the road in a little flat packed with the symbols of born-again Christianity. Martin from the squat described him to me as a fanatical Christian, but he is a charming man all the same, and he received me with great kindness. While Ian has been a dedicated friend of the squat for a long time, he has little patience for its residents. Most of them, according to him, are liars, drunkards, thieves, drug addicts, beggars. I guess this is true. A useless lot. Not true. And he thinks that anything done for them is wasted. Anything given to them goes missing. He seems to expect the place to run like a 3-star hotel, or at least like a Salvation Army shelter. He's very convinced that the squat needs a leader. He was very fond of Michael Davis, and tells me in so many words that he hopes I will, inverted commas, take over. Needless to say, this is the last thing I want to do. Back at the squat, I meditated at the sight of a huge knife on the kitchen table. I've worked in several night shelters before, and believe me, you would rarely see anything sharper than a plastic knife in there. And yet there would be fights quite regularly with blood all over the place, the staff getting all worked up, and of course the police being called to pick up the pieces. Here, most of the time we muddle through without any serious fighting. Where does that come in Ian's assessment? Of course, there have been incidents, the worst one being when Tim Saylor jumped from the roof. He fell down 30 feet or so and broke his back. But on the whole, I would say that this place has been remarkably peaceful ever since it started. I would add that there is a lot of positive friendship around, even if people do bicker and shout and stab each other in the back once in a while. In the evening, I thought of going with a few others to New Covent Garden Market to see if we could get some fruit and veg from the garbage containers behind, because they throw away tons of it. I found Mustafa in the common room with his usual blasé attitude, and when I shouted the suggestion in his ear, because he's hard of hearing, I would not be surprised if this was a result of being roughed up in a Turkish prison, sparks immediately came to his eyes and he got up with a smile. We set off with Ben, a friend of his who doesn't live in the squat. Behind New Covent Garden we found huge garbage bins, one of which contained what looked like edible stuff. I jumped in and started digging through the rubbish, unearthing loads of spinach, cabbage, potatoes, pears, and even a dozen melons. I reminded myself of Ivor, a homeless friend in Coventry, who had the most irresistible urge to inspect every single dustbin he came across, so that walking with him in the streets was an extremely slow and frustrating affair, and who used to turn up in my office with anything from a huge cream cake to a fresh fish, and who was found one day sitting in a state of great jubilation deep inside a similar garbage container. We walked back with as much stuff as we could carry and dumped it on the kitchen table like 3 triumphant hunters. There followed a moving scene of fruit eating by candlelight with Shorty and Sandy, Sarah and Muzzy and a few others. One of those moments when you feel a real sense of community and when the squat seems to have a great future. The euphoria was not to last for long, and a little later I found myself in the worst pickle since I came back to number 1 Clapham Road. It has to be said that there is a real problem of trust in this place. People used to upset me by being too gullible and letting anyone lead them by the nose. Now they've gone to the other extreme. Stories of corruption are circulating all the time, sometimes for good reasons, and people are permanently convinced that they're being fooled and ripped off. Anyone who takes responsibility exposes themselves to criticism, especially if money is involved. I even hear the most terrible stories about Michael Davis, who is held in such high esteem by Bob Nind, Michael Keane and Ian McGowan. Those who occasionally try to help from the outside, from the local council to the churches, are also a regular target of criticism and suspicion, with some exceptions like Nancy Kershaw, who is unanimously regarded as an angel. Ian McGowan is on the blacklist at the moment, accused by some of having colluded with Michael Davis to swindle a few £100 intended for an electricity connection. It's an absurd story. Now, when Dave and Peter came back from some place where they'd had a few pints, Peter took me to his room and we had a very long heart-to-heart conversation which left me quite shattered. He told me that my visits to Michael Keane and Ian McGowan had been noticed. In fact, I had not made a secret of them, and that some people had taken exception to this behaviour. Some even said that I intended to run this place. This, I suspect, is partly an effect of Ian having shared his hopes to this effect with others in the squat. On top of that, Peter, who was clearly a bit tipsy, also told me that he was not a fool. That's true. And that he didn't believe that I was sincere. Not that he thought I was a fraud, but he wondered whether I might be a political agitator or someone who wanted to write a thesis about the squat. His suspicion was quite hurtful, but I accept that some of the things I've done since arriving here raise questions for someone like him. We also had a long conversation about this squat and its future and its spirit and its meaning, which was very interesting. I've clearly underestimated Peter. Far from being, I quote myself, not particularly clever or articulate, he seems to have a complex mind with a basic clear-sightedness, but also more mysterious insights which I did not know whether to attribute to extreme shrewdness, confusion about things that were beyond him, or the temporary haziness of a late Saturday evening. At one point, he said that he used to be a property manager for a big company. I also have the impression that he's been a heavy drinker in the past, perhaps even now. In any case, his ideas about the squat obviously go far beyond those of anybody else here. He goes even further than me in the importance he attaches to the growth of community and belonging, as opposed to physical comfort. His personal view, and his use of this term, made it clear that he was ready to compromise with others on this, as he does every day. And he thought that the squat should not take any outside help at all, that people should learn to fend for themselves, that better facilities, like electricity and showers, would create a queue for this squat all the way to Waterloo, and transform this place into a cheap hostel for the privileged. I admired the courage of his views. Later, while on the night shift at the gate, I had a further talk with Dave and Andy, a Scottish guy who shouts instead of talks and doesn't give a fuck about someone who disagrees with him. He went on about how we are a thorn in the arse of Lambeth Council, how the church is ripping us off, how these cunts should not even be allowed through the fucking gate, and even how the council had paid someone to infiltrate the squat and sell us down the river. I think he's referring to Arthur. Inevitably, he came to the subject of my visits to Michael and particularly Ian, and told me that I should not have gone there on my own without consulting anybody. Perhaps he's right. It was a rather loud conversation, though we ended up the best of friends, and he decreed that we should go together to see Ian the next day and ask him, where the fuck has the money gone? All this opened my eyes to the difficulties of receiving a support network. There's a whole question of what we should and should not accept as far as outside help is concerned. There's the problem of trust and the danger of quarrels and corruption as soon as money is involved. There's the problem of diverse motivations and objectives, humanitarian, evangelical, political, personal, among those who have tried to help from outside. It's a minefield. Eddie took his turn at the gate at 5 a.m, as he does every day. I've discovered that Eddie's appearance of toothlessness and half-witted old man, the poor chap can hardly speak, conceals a very friendly and dedicated spirit. There's always a smile on his face, and if you say hello to him, you can be sure that he'll return the greeting with some joke or another. He's well liked in the squat and widely praised for getting up every morning at the crack of dawn to keep the gate and prepare tea for everybody. Why is there no place for such gems?
Sunday, August the 13th.
A somewhat uneventful day. There was some general cleaning in the morning and much gossiping in the kitchen in the afternoon. At one point a terrific row erupted between Pauline and Craig, and I learnt many new words not in the dictionary. It's hard to believe that lovers can come to such ferocious clashes. Pauline being 4 times as big as Craig, no one intervened, and the fracas stopped before too long. Steve's puppy died today.
Monday, August the 14th.
Was out in the morning, and as I was walking back in the rain in the early afternoon, I met Peter, who was in a great state of agitation. He said that people at the squat were going mental, that we had run out of food and gas again, with hardly a few pounds left for the week, and that he was going to go out and do a bit of shopping. I joined him. He is very friendly, and we talked about many things very openly as we walked. Either he was drunk the other day, or he has decided to give me a chance. Or he is extremely good at disguising his real feelings. Among other things I learnt that Peter used to do. It turns out he was an actor. I've great admiration for him myself, and trust him without hesitation, not because of what he says, but because of his daily attitudes, which show a lot of compassion and kindness. I have been deceived by many people in this kind of situation, even people I thought I could trust, like my brother or sister. But if Peter turns out to be a crook, I will be very surprised and disappointed. As we reached a DIY shop to buy some gas, Peter told me, "Watch that young man I'll say hello to. I'll tell you about him later." And inside he said hello to a young assistant who smiled and returned the greeting. Later, Peter told me that this boy had shared a room with him for 3 months in the squat. He said, "Here is someone who has sorted himself out." We bought gas, bread, milk, cheese, some horrible cheap meat, a few tomatoes, and 6 cans of vegetable soup to keep the squat going until tomorrow. Back at the squat, Dave, who's in charge of the kitchen, was ranting and raving about the fact that the gas had run out because people used it irresponsibly. Public goods, pots, pans, furniture, brooms, etc., are an eternal problem in this house. In the kitchen we found 2 newcomers. The first one, a big guy with a tattered leather jacket called Richard, had the frightened eyes of a rabbit and stammered so badly that it took him ages to go through a sentence. The other chap, Spike, had a frightening physique with bloody tattoos all over his fleshy arms, but most friendly manners, and was accompanied by a rather laughable little dog, appropriately called Mr. Jolly. Spike was explaining to Richard how Mrs. Thatcher's regime resembled in many ways that of Hitler before the Second World War, and from time to time he very patiently waited for Richard's hacked replies. I don't think they had ever met before. I liked both of them immediately. In the evening we were supposed to have a small meeting to discuss Michael Keane's draft constitution. There was no squat meeting on Sunday because it thought better to wait for the report of this working party. This is a very interesting event. At the beginning Michael was there, and since he could only stay for a short time he was naturally very keen to get on the agenda. Effectively he chaired the meeting. The constitution obviously didn't seem very electrifying to most of those present, and there was some doubt as to what its purpose really was. We didn't come to any conclusion. After Michael left, the meeting took its own course, lasting for hours, wandering from one subject to another, punctuated by stories and jokes and gentle quarrels. Naturally, we talked mainly about things that were foremost in people's minds: money, food, dog shit, security, organisation. Several initiatives were taken, e.g. Jonathan, a new bloke, offered to go around bakeries in the evenings to get free leftover bread. I felt like it was an excellent meeting. We spent the rest of the evening lazing around by the gate. Steve was drunk, and this was the occasion for an outrageously comical if deplorable scene. It has to be said that Steve gets very argumentative, though rarely violent, when he's drunk. Now suddenly here comes a man who calls himself McGuinness and says that he's from the BBC. According to Steve himself, he is in fact quite famous. Accompanied by a woman who explains that they want to produce a TV serial about the squat and even a drama about the condition of the homelessness in London, Steve exploded like a bomb. A drama? A drama? You can fuck off, man. I know who you are. You're here to make money out of the homeless. You get your little name on a TV screen. Every time we've had you people in here, we've had nothing but trouble. A drama? Everyone knows what the life of the homeless in London is like, but nobody is going to do fuck all about it. And so on. McGuinness and his friend were sitting there, petrified, patiently enduring the bashing. Finally, Steve was dragged away, after which the woman, obviously relieved, affected a good-humoured attitude and said, "Oh, he did give us a hard time, didn't he?" Upon which Andy, who was sitting across the table, gave her a cruel look and said between his teeth, "So am I." And he proceeded to tell them off without mincing his words.
Tuesday, August the 15th.
Out most of the day, though I was there at dinner time. This is a bit of a social occasion with people queuing for their grub, as in a soup kitchen, and then sitting around the tables in the common room and chatting while digging into their spuds. Had a long talk with Julian, who seems to be some kind of dropout from the public school system, if his Oxford accent is any indication. He follows the international news quite closely and gets terribly depressed by the situation in Lebanon, the disappearance of the rainforest in Brazil, etc. He has no hope for this world, and he tells me that it's waiting for the Holocaust so that the place gets cleaned up a little bit. Meanwhile, he's one of the more sociable and active members of the squat. I also had a long talk with Mustafa, who is decidedly an intriguing character. Apparently he's a trained lawyer and used to practice in Turkey. He wrote a thesis in Turkish on the relationship between international law and domestic law, but couldn't submit it because his supervisor emigrated and later died. Now he wants to write a book about Heidegger, he says. Meanwhile, he writes book reviews, film critiques, etc. for magazines. Once he wrote in the Turkish edition of Playboy something about the sexual mores of tribals. He finds it hard to do serious writing here in the absence of middle-class luxuries. Good light, coffee, a drink. He also says that he has to sort out his mind. He wants to find some work, earn some money, get out of here and write. He likes many people in this place, but finds a few others quite crazy.
Wednesday, August 16th.
Helped with some cleaning and mopping in the morning. Thought I would go to Christchurch to ask for a bucket of hot water. Usually we mop the floor with cold water. My request was received with unexpected consternation. I was told that we're not really into helping the Belgrave anymore, and that, all right, I'll give you a bucket this time, but I'll have to talk about it with so-and-so. I didn't know what to say. Fair enough, Christchurch has lost quite a few pots and pans by trying to help us in the past, and perhaps they've been betrayed in other ways too, and they may have all sorts of good reasons for keeping their distance. But I wasn't aware that this would extend to thinking twice about giving us a bucket of hot water. Found Steve sitting in the common room when I came back in the afternoon. He was looking very dejected and his left eye was black and swollen. He told me that he'd had a scuffle with Alex the previous night. Alex is a dark-skinned chap with most gentle manners, but he apparently blew up when Steve made some racist remark. Steve was very apologetic and admitted that it was entirely his fault. Later I saw them apologising to each other in the corridor. This, as far as I can remember, is the first incident of violence since I came back to number 1 Clapham Road exactly 2 weeks ago. In the evening we had another meeting. Only 25 people attended. There are about 70 of us in the squat at the moment. Dave chaired the meeting, but most of the time it was hard to guess that anyone was chairing at all. The conversation was constantly jumping from one subject to another, with very few decisions being taken, if any. In a way, these meetings are less a decision-making institution than a forum which gives people a chance to air their views and feelings and anxieties and hopes in public. An opportunity to share, and am I deluding myself, slowly become a community. Although the turnout was not very high, there was a sense of togetherness that I had not felt before. Participation in the discussion was very high, and by the end of the meeting, a new wind of solidarity and hope was blowing. Among other things, we discussed the usual problem of cleaning, counts, dog shit, rent paying, and lack of participation on the part of some of the residents. There was another sentimental speech about the need to take the rough with the smooth together, this time by Steve, who explained that he had initially intended to live here only for a couple of days after he was mugged, but that he had now decided to stay because he felt this place was his home, and here he found peace of mind. Not bad, considering that only a few hours before he'd got a thrashing from Alex. The question of participation cropped up again and again. At one point Arthur made some very contemptuous comments about the people who lived here, and even said something to the effect that the house was a load of shit. This provoked a wave of protest and some further emotional speeches about the fact that we can already be proud of what we have accomplished. Alex asked all those who were prepared to do some work to keep the place going to raise their hand, and everyone did except Arthur and Graham, the guy who had given me such a pessimistic account of the politics of the squat only 10 days ago. The financial situation was, of course, also on the agenda. An aborted attempt was made to sort out who had ripped us off and when. Alex and others followed him, strongly complained about the allegations that were regularly heard against Michael Davis, and maintained that the guy cared about this place and about those who lived here. Alex thought there ought to be a pool table in the common room and suggested that we organise a sponsored walk to raise the necessary funds. I thought that this was an excellent meeting, and so did several other participants, including Peter. I have to agree with Peter that the common hardship caused by the financial morass seems to be a factor of greater solidarity and concern. Peter is making admirable efforts to persuade people to pay their rent. He invites each non-payer to see him individually and discuss the problem. And the number of contributors is increasing day by day, about 35 at the moment. But this is a fragile equilibrium. The people could start withdrawing their rent at any time on the grounds that many others don't pay either. And of course, if Peter were to leave or to resign from this stressful responsibility, we would all be in a real soup. I remember him telling me with a smile a few days ago, "They told me I wouldn't last 3 weeks, but I'm tougher than they think." I hope that he's right. The collection of the rent is of course helped by the new system of refusing meals to those who don't pay their weekly £5. If people queue for a meal without having paid their rent, Dave sends them to Peter, who assesses whether they have valid reasons not to have paid. This system, which seems to work so far, is the nearest thing to coercion or sanction that exists in this squat. Perhaps it's sad and we have to adopt this measure, but as things stand, I think that there is a case for it. It allows people to stay here even if they don't want to pay rent, and diffuses pressures to get rid of the antisocial elements in more coercive ways. After the meeting, I went out to have a cup of tea with Arthur and Graham. Both of them are extremely disillusioned about the squat. Arthur describes himself as a cynic, and Graham gave me another powerful lecture about the absence of participation and cooperation and how it was all hopeless. Apparently both he and Arthur used to be quite positively active, but they have obviously given up after some disheartening experience or another. They're convinced that if people cooperated, great things would happen, but they're now quite cynical about the prospects of cooperation. They seem to expect a lot from a bunch of homeless people who have been thrown together by circumstances with little prior experience of community living and little in common other than their homelessness. In spite of our differences of views, I like both Arthur and Graham a lot. They've certainly done their bit to make the squat work.
Thursday, August the 17th.
There was a post-weekly meeting enthusiasm in the air this morning, with quite a few people busying themselves with mops and brooms. Even Mustafa had a go at mopping. Never mind if the pathetic result betrayed his past of left-wing intellectual. In the early evening, I roamed about in Camden in search of some free food to fill our miserable larder. I managed to get 12 loaves of brown bread from a bakery and 2 huge and only slightly damaged melons from the fruit market. This catch impressed Jonathan, the chap who said on Monday that he would go around collecting leftover food from shops. So far he only managed some chicken and a few pig's legs from a butcher. He says that the bakeries round here won't give him any bread because they already give leftovers to someone who takes them away as animal feed. We decided to try together next time. I was out until late in the evening, but when I came back I learnt that Alex had punched someone again. Intriguing, given that Alex is one of the nicest and most sensible people around. Apparently he is on drugs when it happened. We ought to discuss the question of violence at one of our next meetings, because nothing is more important than to keep the place peaceful. The place peaceful. Another worry is the rising incidence of drinking on the premises. In the early days there used to be a strict and on the whole successfully applied rule against drinking in the squat. Now it's common to find people walking in quite openly with cans of beer or bottles of cider. So far this has not created any problem, but what will happen in the winter when we'll have to deal with people who drink heavily and often get violent when they're drunk? This place could be ruined. A strict control would be hard to enforce as things stand, but if we reaffirmed the rule against drinking on the premises, voluntary restraint would hopefully prevent an escalation of the problem. Found the gate wide open when I came back late at night. A true house of hospitality.
Friday, August the 18th.
Out most of the day.
Saturday, August the 19th.
Out most of the day again. Bumped into Steve, Muzzy and Sarah at midday as I was walking through Kennington Park across the road. Steve was happily sipping a bottle of cider and told us some good stories about his travels in Holland and Germany. He also told me that he was getting married. Apparently a black woman came to him this morning as he was begging in Leicester Square, and asked him if he was British, then if he was a homosexual, then whether he would come for a walk with her. Then she explained that she wanted to become a British citizen, and would he marry her for the purpose, and they could divorce a few weeks later. She would give him some money for the trouble. Steve thought that there was nothing wrong with this, if it helps her. He's meeting her again tomorrow to discuss the details. In the early evening, I spent some time clearing the front of the building, which is a bit of a rubbish tip. I started on my own, but soon others joined me, including Richard and Julian. Richard is another of those who really seem to have found a home here. Before coming to number 1 Clapham Road, he was out in the cold, sleeping in railway stations or on the pavement. His simple-mindedness and his stammering are severe handicaps out there, but here he's one of the most valuable and valued members of the community, always ready to work and capable of moving mountains with his body of a weightlifter. Late in the evening, I bumped into Colin in the Bull Ring. That's by Waterloo Station, where hundreds of people live in cardboard boxes. Colin used to be with us in January. He's not even 20. He's extremely nice, but I feel lacking in confidence and always vulnerable to the slippery slope of bad community, drugs and glue sniffing. At the moment he seems to be doing well though. He has a girlfriend and they want to travel somewhere far away together. Meanwhile, he needs to find some work to pay off a £70 fine he got for smuggling hash through Dover on his way back from Holland. He only had a microscopic amount of it, but he was shaking like hell as he was going through the customs, and even more after they asked him why he was shaking, and even more after they strip searched him.
Sunday, August the 20th.
Today was cleaning day, with the whole squat being tidied from top to bottom. Keeping this huge building with its 5 floors and 100-odd rooms in a decent state is an almost hopeless task. Although everything said and done, most visitors are quite impressed by the general tidiness of the place. I helped for 4 hours, and my estimate is that during this time 20 people or so participated in various capacities. This is really not bad, considering that it was a beautiful sunny day and that anyone who feels like shirking can just walk through the gate and take it easy. Richard worked like a dog until late in the afternoon on an empty stomach. A late lunch come dinner was planned today, and he couldn't afford to go out and buy himself some chips. By the end of the day, the place looked like a cheap hotel, with the marble on the ground floor shining bravely through the dust. Everything considered, my verdict is that Peter is essentially a good shepherd figure. He keeps mentioning how people come to him for this or that, sighing about how he has to cope with this or that problem. Someone about to commit suicide, another refusing to pay her rent, money running out. And generally there is a good dose of paternalism in his behaviour. He tends to keep somewhat aloof, and perhaps he could do more to encourage other people to take responsibilities. Although he insists that he only does what people ask him to, he's increasingly being looked at as a pillar of the place. E.g., if a visitor comes, he or she is often directed directly to Peter. Obviously, insofar as some people are bound to be more active than others, it's much better to have someone like Peter, or Dave for that matter, shouldering the heavier responsibilities than some authoritarian leader like Tim Saylor or Doon. My only worry is that Peter seems to be quite a fragile person. He gets very personally anxious when something goes wrong, partly because he cares so much for the place, partly because he unconsciously seeks the feeling of being burdened by heavy responsibilities, partly because of a limited ability to relax. In the last few days he's been particularly sombre. Among other things, there is a setback in the number of rent payers. Peter looks disheartened, smokes a lot, and even, I think, drinks quite regularly in the evening.